So welcome to this lecture on migrant-led protest, activism and resistance. And in the past couple of lectures we've been focusing on punishing borders and everyday bordering. But really what we're going to look at in this is to try and flesh out the fuller picture so we can understand how borders may be experienced but also resisted. So over the past couple of weeks, we've looked at the condition of the asylum seeker and the processes and the rules and regulations in place to construct specific migrant categories. And we've looked at processes of everyday bordering through rules and regulations that not only filter, screen, but also seek to tame via this logic of domo politics, but also contribute to the making of us all as border guards. And as I asked at the end of the last lecture, can this be the only outcome of this interface between migrants and the state and migrants and the public? And might there not be other outcomes? The radical potential of immigrant protest precisely resides in the ways in which migrants organise and act, despite their lack of access to the rights and protections of citizenship. Indeed, given the increasingly controlling and excluding function of many statist forms of citizenship, migrant activists and scholars have increasingly adopted a language of local, transnational and global citizenship. Nyers and Regiel talk about this when they say that the institutionalisation of more restrictive policies regulating mobility can also be understood as new ways of being political. So in this lecture we're going to map out some of these ideas and think sociologically about migrant activism, protest and resistance. So the first thing I'd like to do is pause and go to the Daytona and Murillo reading and reflect on these questions. Resistance, activism and protest are directly related to a set of social conditions and a growing realisation of the common predicaments in which people find themselves and over which they have the potential to unite. So think through these questions and think about the formation of groups as subjective actors whose acts are specifically intended to counter experiences of marginalisation, segregation and disempowerment, and effect change in how certain categories of people are treated and perceived. So I'd like you to think about the reading and think about these questions. So to explore this, we need to return a bit to what might have been described as migrant agency in the past. So rethinking migrants not just as objects but also subjects. And historically in the literature, the main dominant model for looking at migrant agency has been through the lens of the association, resulting often in largely descriptive case studies describing what migrants do. Often the association has tended to be the start and end point of understandings of mobilisation. But we can also trace out a temporal shift here, so from pre-1990s literature looking at associations as largely innocuous and functionalist, to a post-1990s literature that has a more critical engagement with the social arrangements which people find themselves in. So looking at the pre-1990s, there's been a tendency to analyse organisations and migrant organising as well-defined and bounded groups, and that within these groups of difference, everyone was pretty much the same. So this focus on community in inverted commas. Associations were also, however, seen as evidence of failure to integrate. But at the same time, and over time, they were seen as essential to integration. Because they would be considered as ways of individuals to maintain cultural practices and traditions from elsewhere, so in this way failure to integrate, but also provide important resources and sources of support to people, and so essential. There is this question of representativeness and to what extent migrant groups might be representative of the communities they are said to serve. There's a centrality of assumed ethnicity that would provide some kind of unproblematic unity. Informal networks may be more important than formal networks, and this was particularly been the case with refugee organisations. But what we don't really see in this literature pre-1990s is this attentiveness to the informal activities of particular groups and organisations. In the post-1990s context, we see a shift in the emergence of associations as a response to harsh conditions of reception and increasingly restrictive immigration regimes, and a shift towards a more critical understanding of agency that speaks to some of the pre-1990s limitations. Some of the factors, so we see here some descriptions of organisations which are a shift away from more functionalist perspectives. Some of the factors contributing to this include the endless succession of changing rules of immigration that continuously reset the parameters of settlement, state-produced effects of liminality and precarity, an increased instability apparent in the ambiguities associated with different immigration status and different rights and entitlements related to different immigration status. We've seen social segregation in areas of multiple deprivation and how this can drive individuals into forming groups. There's been a focus in the development of associations as a refusal to be seen as people from nowhere. This is particularly significant in Catherine Kiminal's work on the African women's movement in France. People wanting to take initiative and control over how their settlement can be experienced. And the development of collective identities as tools which group members use in confrontations with others in different social contexts. And also we've seen in the association work in the post-1990s context, activities punctuated by public events which are an opportunity to publicly defend collective identities and points of view on settlement experiences. This allows for a greater attentiveness to internal heterogeneity and the conflicts and tensions that this can produce. So rather than imposing a kind of fictive unity based around so-called collective ethnicity, what we see is greater attentiveness to diversity within. And we also see associations as being used to challenge stigma and raise visibility. And this shift provides some groundwork for widening out then how we might think sociologically about activism, not necessarily as complete defiance or compliance, but rather as occupying a space somewhere in between. And this is important, as we've already seen across this course. Media, political and everyday discourse tend to construct some migrants as being more migrant than others. Therefore, we do still need to be cautious about using terms that could be interpreted as sweeping generalisations. And we also need to attend to the ways in which, within this framework of migrant-led activism, social identities intersect with each other all the time. Majiguen Cissé, when talking about the sans-papiers movement in France, speaks of the sexism inherent within that movement that she helped to set up. So it's an important check and balance here that activism and action and mobilisation are all fuelled by multiple identities and the social positions such identities force people into. It could also contribute to frustration felt by those thus categorised. De Tona and Moreo suggest using the term migrant or migrant-led as reference to a standpoint which manifests itself against the practical everyday implications of migration policies. This also connects to the idea that protest and resistance may be loud and quiet, above and below the radar, visible and invisible, and we'll go on to explore this in this session. So some of the implications of a broader conceptualization of activism I think is important to explore briefly here. Nars and Rigel and De Tona Moreo argue that the fact that the very figure of the refugee exists is a form of protest. Taking flight is a political act. But it is as if we then expect that agency to stop once people have fled. And as we have been exploring, people in the asylum process in particular are often caught between two competing and often overlapping discursive regimes, that of humanitarianism and that of securitisation, both of which often deny the political subjectivities of people kind of caught in this crossfire. Activism will also vary in terms of formal structure, recognition by state bodies and NGOs, and they're concerned with policy issues, but more on providing information for practical assistance. This type of migrant-led activism and standpoint activism has been particularly relevant in women-led groups, often developing from friendship groups that offer to each other childcare support, that then develop organically into something else that is much more proactive and politically transformative. And there is a shift towards experience-based activism, which reveals the potential for broader solidarities, the very act of awareness of the inherently contingent nature of the lived experience of being people in between, or as Dutton and Maria talk about, the classical condition of the migrant. This becomes the very grounds of people's marginalisation, i.e. their migranthood, and provides knowledge and resources to build their mobilisation. And we see new patterns of mobilisation emerge, with people cohering and mobilising around shared issues and troubles. And this itself is fuelled by a wider social, cultural, economic and political context. For example, the changing migration patterns in the UK, but also across Europe, and the endless succession of changing rules, the development of the hostile environment. If we think back to last week and the discussion on pushback from organisations like Docs Not Cops, Against Borders for Children, and the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. So the understanding of resistance that I want to use here is informed by the influential work of the anthropologist and political scientist James C. Scott and the Black radical theorist Ambalavarnar Sivanandan. So if we briefly look at Scott's work, if we think about migrants, so precarious workers, people claiming asylum, sans-papiers, refugees, if we think about how we might understand resistance, we could argue that they accumulate multiple forms of resistance, but this is less well documented. It is not necessarily a feature of the collective imagination, nor is it headline grabbing. And Scott argues that focusing on the visible event misses subtle but powerful forms of everyday resistance. Scott conceptualised everyday resistance as the ways in which the vulnerable work to stay invisible to the powers that be, by hiding and obscuring identities and activities that the state or other powerful institutions prohibit. The state and other institutions simply are not present or powerful enough to see all aspects of social life, or they don't consider certain aspects of social life important enough to regulate. Scott is also useful, I think, in identifying a focus on intent rather than recognition and outcome, as some actions intended to resist are purposefully concealed. And this will demonstrate some of the ways in which everyday acts can chip away in often imperceptible ways at prevailing power relations and over time effect important social change. Sivanandan's conceptualisation of communities of resistance is framed by a different tradition, that of the self-help tradition of Black unity movement in the UK, in the form of community groups and associations across ethnic classifications that has emerged from discrimination in housing, education and employment. So we have African, Caribbean and Asian communities mobilising around shared causes and issues, which led to the emergence of supplementary grassroots support services and training schemes and other projects that targeted the Black community here and Black youth in a political Blackness, and the creation of spaces of survival in their absence, so Black homework clubs, Black women's groups, Black youth clubs and even Black schools. And in the UK, much of the way in which migrant associationism has been theorised, particularly in the kind of pre-1990s, has followed the race relations model, and in fact, arguably undermining self-reliance and independence of Black and other minority grassroots initiatives. Sivanandan's more explicitly critical perspective on association development emphasises that associations emerge through choice, but also through a desire for important social change, and in this sense, their emergence can be understood to have transformative qualities. Collective action results in the formation of groups as conscious, subjective actors specifically intended to counter experiences of marginalisation, segregation and disempowerment, and to effect change in how certain immigrant and minority populations are treated and perceived. And I'd like you to pause here and reflect on these questions about the continued relevance then of Scott and Sivanandan's work, and how we might trace these two contemporary society, looking at Attach, Rigiel and Sterl's work as an additional reading raises questions, I think, that are interesting about more recent migrant mobilisation. And maybe think about how these work to help us challenge problematic binaries between us and them. Nias and Rigiel ask, why is it that migrant resistances, especially as they relate to people in the asylum process and refugees, have not taken root in the collective imagination? They argue they exist at the margins of mainstream society and media, but this does not diminish their significance. So how might we characterise these forms of resistance? And I'd like to look at three kind of typical features. The first is looking at this question of risk. There are a series of risks and tensions that unfold from political strategies of visibility and representation. Physical violence, removal if occupying a space, as in the case of the sans-papiers, eviction, deportation, reprisals, dismissals, arrests. So in very material ways, becoming visible through protest and demanding rights exposes irregular migrants to the full force of state border controls. So for many people, making themselves visible through protest is an activity engaged in only as a last resort. As Imogen Tyler has documented in her account of naked protest undertaken by mothers in Yarlswood Detention Centre, some of those who took part in the protest were disciplined and penalised by having their deportations fast-tracked. The second idea here is around solidarity, and this is both cause and issue-based and often transcends well-defined bounded groups. It can translate as solidarity through a shared social fate, gaining wider public support, migrants alongside non-migrants, for example, students and staff at universities with migrant workers. It can also be about the processes themselves, as solidarity in asserting rights and solidarity in winning, learning about rights, protesters' legacies, for example, the way in which the sans-papiers movement has informed and led to much of the No Borders movement and No One is Illegal movements. And this last one here is about visibility and audibility, being seen and heard. Visibility is often used to police migration flows, but the practices of certain migrant activists reveal that becoming perceptible is also a strategy of resistance. Making migrant experiences visible and audible, so being seen and heard, is often the overarching aim of immigrant protests. But the punishing effects of visibility lead Papadopoulos and Tsianos to argue that visibility, in the context of illegal migration, belongs to the inventory of the technologies for policing migrational flows. So if we think here about visibility as part of a technology, making people visible is also something important, another twist on how we understand these features. And I'd like to pause here and watch these short clips. They're all about 2 or 3 minutes long and reflect on questions of representation, invisibility, voice, power, how we may challenge dominant narratives and challenge the status quo, and think about the everydayness of some of these experiences. So I'd like you to reflect, watch these clips, and reflect and bring your notes to class. And whereas historically the emergence of associations as mobilisation has focused on the perspective of migrants and their identification with shared causes as experienced as by other marginalised groups, increasingly we are seeing a crossover, so a connection between migrants and non-migrant populations as well. But there is, I think, a question here of scale and scope. And can extending across this kind of joining up of activism that reaches across immigration status, so bringing together people for whom citizenship status and immigration status is not a concern, with those for whom it is central or becomes central through the technologies of immigration control and managed migration, can this produce a different kind of domopolitics? Can it help us find a way to a different way of understanding domopolitics? What do you think? And here I've got another activity I'd like you to undertake. On Moodle, I will be posting, I'll be allocating a reading, and this is really about mastering a case study that you can present to each other. So to cover some of the many examples of resistance that we've looked at that are covered in the reading list. And I'd like you to prepare this to present in class. You'll have 5 minutes each to present the key points, but think about some of these questions to stimulate the discussion and to inspire your answers. So some final thoughts here. Some of the key points we've looked at are the vast territory, in fact, between defiance, collective defiance and complete compliance. And actually much of the migrant-led activism that we've explored briefly here, but also in the reading, can be found occupying this space. But these are fluid social dynamics that shape the nature of alliances, and these dynamics are also shaped by wider economic, social, cultural and political context. And some of the key characteristics of migrant-led protests that we've looked at are around being seen and heard, about sharing solidarity, but also the consequences and the implications of this. So while resistance occurs at a personal level, arguably, Sivanandan and Scott would say, and Daytona Murillo, that it's at its most effective when it resonates with a community of resistors who can have shared experience, who can support each other and speak with and for each other. But is this enough? How do we also resist in the stories that we tell, in the way that we use the language of resistance, in the way that we explore the experiences of migration, both from that bottom up and top down? And I'd like to finish with this kind of question, I suppose a challenge to you, a challenge to me as a researcher and educator, that what might be our own roles in thinking through the concepts we use to explain these phenomena. And I think this is taking us back to this question of categorical fetishism that we began our 3 sessions with.